The smallest decisions often become the biggest turning points, but you never recognize them until years later. That thought stayed with me every time the weather forecast mentioned thunderstorms, because one stormy night completely rewrote the future I thought had already been decided. My name is Lucas Carter, and for the longest time I believe people eventually stopped dreaming because reality always collected the bill. At 28, I lived alone in a small rental house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon. My days followed the same predictable rhythm. I woke before sunrise, poured a mug of black coffee, drove 25 minutes to the furniture warehouse where I managed inventory, returned home after dark, heated whatever dinner happened to be in the freezer, and spent the evening pretending not to notice the unfinished woodworking sketches hidden inside the bottom drawer of my dining table. Years earlier, I had imagined building furniture that carried stories instead of price tags. But life had a way of convincing me that dreams belonged to younger people with more courage than I ever possessed. I stopped drawing, stopped carving wood, and eventually stopped believing there was any reason to begin again. The only constant outside my routine was the quiet man living next door. Ryan Mitchell had moved into the neighborhood about 3 years earlier. Everyone seemed to know him, although nobody could explain exactly when they had become friends with him. He repaired broken fences without being asked, carried groceries for elderly neighbors, fixed bicycles for children on Saturday mornings, and somehow remembered everyone's first name. We exchanged polite greetings whenever our schedules crossed paths, yet our conversations rarely lasted more than a minute. There was something calm about him that made silence feel comfortable instead of awkward, but I never allowed myself to get close enough to learn anything more. That Thursday evening, the sky darkened hours before sunset. Thick clouds swallowed the last traces of daylight, while the local weather station warned that powerful winds could reach nearly 50 miles per hour. By the time I pulled into my driveway, rain had already begun pounding the windshield so hard the houses across the street looked like blurred watercolor paintings. I hurried inside, carrying a paper grocery bag against my chest, only to hear the lights flicker twice before the entire house disappeared into darkness. The refrigerator fell silent. The air conditioner stopped humming. Even the digital clock on the microwave vanished. I sighed, found the flashlight buried inside a kitchen drawer, and stared through the front window as rain battered the neighborhood. Lightning flashed across the sky, briefly revealing Ryan standing on his porch wearing a dark rain jacket. Instead of rushing inside, he looked toward my house as if making sure everything was all right. A few seconds later, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, cold wind swept into the hallway, carrying the scent of wet pine trees. Ryan offered an easy smile despite the storm surrounding us. "Looks like the power company is going to need a while," he said. "I've got a fireplace, a backup generator, and more soup than one person could ever finish. You don't have to spend the night sitting in the dark alone." I almost thanked him and closed the door. Saying no had become my safest habit. But another blast of thunder rolled overhead. The flashlight dimmed in my hand, and for reasons I still couldn't explain, I looked into the steady kindness in his eyes and heard myself answer with one simple word. "Okay." Ryan stepped aside as I entered his house, and the first thing I noticed was the warmth. It wrapped around me so gently that I almost forgot the cold rain soaking through my jacket. The steady crackling of a real fireplace filled the living room, replacing the sharp sound of thunder outside with something calm and familiar. The scent of cedar, fresh coffee, and homemade vegetable soup lingered in the air, making the house feel less like a building and more like a place where people actually lived instead of simply passing through. Ryan took my wet jacket without hesitation and handed me a thick towel before disappearing into the kitchen. "You can warm up by the fire," he called. "Dinner is almost ready." I stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure whether to sit or remain near the door, but eventually the warmth won the argument. I settled into a comfortable chair facing the fireplace while rain continued tapping against the windows. My eyes wandered around the room. Everything looked simple, yet every piece seemed intentionally chosen. The bookshelves were handmade. The coffee table carried subtle carving details that looked surprisingly familiar. Even the rocking chair beside the fireplace had smooth curves unlike anything sold in ordinary furniture stores. When Ryan returned carrying 2 bowls of soup, he placed one in front of me along with slices of warm bread. "Nothing fancy," he said with an easy smile. "It just tastes better when somebody else is here to help finish it." I laughed quietly before taking the first spoonful. The soup was rich, comforting, and somehow exactly what I needed after the miserable drive home. For several minutes, neither of us spoke very much. The silence never felt uncomfortable. Instead, it felt peaceful, as though conversation could happen naturally whenever it wanted instead of being forced to fill empty space. Eventually, Ryan nodded toward the bookshelf behind me. "You still read historical architecture?" he asked. I looked over my shoulder and blinked. Several books focused on traditional woodworking, American craftsmanship, and furniture design. They happened to be the exact subjects I had loved years ago. I admitted. I have not touched any of those books in a long time. Ryan simply nodded without pressing further. "They are worth coming back to." Something about the way he said those words stayed with me. It sounded less like advice and more like quiet confidence. After dinner, we carried our bowls into the kitchen together. I offered to wash the dishes, but Ryan refused with a smile. "Guests are not allowed to do dishes during storms." I shook my head. "Is that an actual rule?" "It is now." We both laughed, and I realized it was the first genuine laugh I had shared with another person in longer than I cared to admit. While he cleaned the kitchen, I wandered slowly through the living room. Framed photographs lined one wall. Most showed neighborhood gatherings, community picnics, children planting flowers, and older couples smiling beside handmade benches. Ryan appeared in almost every picture, yet he never stood in the center. He always seemed happiest helping someone else. Near the hallway, I noticed a small wooden side table with an elegant design that immediately caught my attention. My fingers brushed lightly across its smooth surface. The joinery looked remarkably similar to sketches I had once filled entire notebooks trying to perfect. Before I could study it longer, another flash of lightning illuminated the hallway, revealing a sturdy wooden door at the far end of the house. Unlike every other room, that door remained firmly closed. It carried no decoration, no window, and no obvious purpose, yet something about it quietly pulled at my attention. Ryan walked into the hallway carrying 2 mugs of hot tea and noticed exactly where I was looking. For the first time that evening, his calm expression changed ever so slightly. He smiled politely, but there was unmistakable hesitation in his eyes as he gently said, "That room can wait a little longer." Ryan handed me the mug of hot tea, and I accepted it with a quiet thank you, pretending that I had not noticed the hesitation in his voice. He did not seem like someone who hid things out of fear. If anything, it felt as though whatever was behind that closed door simply belonged to another time. We returned to the living room where the fire continued burning steadily, casting soft golden light across the handmade furniture. Outside, rain drummed against the roof while occasional flashes of lightning briefly illuminated the dark neighborhood beyond the windows. The storm showed no signs of ending anytime soon. Ryan sat across from me with his own mug resting comfortably between his hands. For a while we talked about ordinary things. He asked how long I had worked at the warehouse, and I admitted it had been nearly 6 years. I asked what he did for a living, expecting a simple answer, but he only smiled. "I build things when people need them." It sounded almost too broad to be an occupation, yet somehow it suited him perfectly. We laughed about difficult weather forecasts in Oregon, favorite coffee shops, and the strange habit neighbors had of waving at each other even when they barely knew one another. The conversation flowed naturally, and before long, I realized hours had passed without either of us checking a clock. That surprised me more than anything else. I had grown used to conversations ending quickly because I rarely allowed them to become meaningful. Yet sitting across from Ryan felt strangely effortless. Eventually, I stood to stretch my legs and wandered toward the bookshelves once again. This time I noticed something I had overlooked earlier. Tucked between several woodworking books sat an old notebook with worn leather covers. It looked almost identical to the kind I used years ago for sketching furniture ideas. I did not open it. Instead, I simply smiled at the coincidence before my attention drifted toward another shelf holding several small wooden models. One resembled a reading bench with gently curved armrests. Another looked like a children's bookshelf shaped like the branches of a tree. A third was a compact writing desk with hidden storage compartments. Every design stirred a vague feeling of recognition that I could not explain. They were not exact copies of anything I remembered drawing, yet they carried the same style, the same quiet balance between practicality and comfort that had once filled countless evenings at my own kitchen table. "You have a good eye," Ryan said as he joined me. Most people notice the fireplace before the furniture. I smiled awkwardly. These feel familiar somehow. He looked at the models for a moment before answering. Good ideas often find their way into more than one person's imagination. His response was gentle, but it left even more questions than answers. Another loud clap of thunder shook the windows, and the lights connected to the backup generator flickered briefly before returning to normal. Ryan excused himself to check the generator in the garage. Left alone for only a minute, I slowly walked down the hallway again. I had no intention of invading his privacy, but my curiosity continued pulling me toward the closed wooden door. Standing only a few feet away, I noticed faint scratches near the doorknob, as though it had been opened and closed countless times over the years. Beneath the door, a thin line of warm light escaped across the hardwood floor. There was also a faint scent unlike anything else in the house. Freshly cut cedar mixed with linseed oil and polished maple drifted quietly through the narrow gap. My heartbeat quickened. Whatever existed behind that door was clearly alive with purpose, not forgotten storage. Before I could step any closer, Ryan's footsteps echoed softly from the garage. I turned immediately, feeling oddly guilty despite never touching the handle. Ryan stopped beside me and looked from my face to the closed door. This time there was no hesitation in his expression, only quiet understanding. After a long moment, he offered a small smile and said, "Maybe tomorrow morning it will finally be time for you to see what is inside." The storm finally began to weaken sometime before sunrise. Instead of violent thunder shaking the windows, only a gentle rain remained, tapping softly against the roof like a quiet reminder of everything the night had changed. I woke on the comfortable couch with a folded blanket still covering my shoulders and the smell of fresh coffee drifting in from the kitchen. For the first time in years, I realized I had slept through an entire night without waking from anxious thoughts. Ryan greeted me with the same calm smile, as if sharing breakfast with a neighbor after a storm was the most ordinary thing in the world. We ate scrambled eggs, toasted bread, and fresh fruit while sunlight slowly pushed through the gray clouds outside. The conversation moved easily from favorite hiking trails to local farmers markets and old houses around Portland that had been restored instead of demolished. Every topic somehow circled back to creating something that could last. After breakfast, Ryan quietly collected our dishes and looked toward the hallway. "I think it is time," he said. My heartbeat immediately quickened because I knew exactly which room he meant. Without another word, he walked toward the closed wooden door, reached into his pocket, and removed a small brass key polished smooth from years of use. He unlocked the door slowly, almost respectfully, then stepped aside before saying, "Go ahead." I hesitated only for a second before crossing the threshold. Warm morning sunlight poured through tall windows on the opposite wall, filling the room with a soft golden glow. The scent of cedar, walnut, maple, and fresh wood shavings surrounded me immediately. It was not a storage room at all. It was a complete woodworking studio unlike anything I had ever imagined. Workbenches lined one side of the room, carefully organized with chisels, planes, clamps, carving knives, and measuring tools. Shelves displayed finished furniture with flawless craftsmanship, while larger projects rested beneath protective cloths waiting for completion. Every surface reflected years of patient work. I slowly walked farther inside, unable to find words. Then I noticed something that stopped me completely. Resting on the central workbench was a reading chair with gently curved armrests and a hidden bookshelf built into its side. I knew that design. Years earlier, I had filled an entire notebook exploring the exact same concept before convincing myself it was too impractical to build. Nearby stood a writing desk with concealed drawers arranged almost exactly as I had once imagined during long evenings after work. Against another wall sat a child's bookshelf shaped like the branches of a growing oak tree, remarkably similar to sketches I had abandoned before anyone else had ever seen them. One by one, I recognized pieces that should have existed only inside forgotten notebooks and fading memories. I turned slowly toward Ryan, searching his face for an explanation. He did not appear nervous or proud. He simply stood quietly, watching me with gentle understanding. "How?" was the only word I managed to ask. Ryan took a slow breath before answering. "You talked about these ideas more often than you remember. Sometimes while checking the mail. Sometimes while shoveling snow. Sometimes after work when we happened to stand outside for a few minutes. You always apologized for dreaming too much, but I never believed dreams were something to apologize for. I stared back at the workshop, overwhelmed by the impossible feeling that someone had protected a part of my life I had abandoned years before. Ryan walked to one of the covered projects and gently pulled away the cloth, revealing another unfinished piece waiting beneath. "There is still more," he said softly. "This room is only the beginning of what I have been hoping to show you." My eyes remained fixed on the unfinished piece resting beneath the morning light, while countless questions raced through my mind. Every curve of the wood, every carefully measured joint, and every unfinished edge reflected an idea I thought had disappeared years ago. I slowly walked around the workbench, hardly believing what I was seeing. Ryan never interrupted the silence. He understood that some discoveries needed room to settle before words could find them. After several long moments, I finally turned toward him. "Why would you do all of this for me?" My voice sounded quieter than I expected. Ryan rested one hand gently on the edge of the workbench before answering. "Because every time you talked about building furniture, your eyes changed. You smiled without realizing it. Then one day you stopped talking about it completely. I figured life had convinced you to let go of something that still deserved a chance." I shook my head in disbelief. "I barely remember telling you any of those things." He smiled softly. "You probably do not. Most of those conversations lasted less than 5 minutes. Sometimes they happened while we were both bringing in trash cans after pickup day. Sometimes while clearing snow from our driveways. Sometimes while watching the neighborhood children ride bicycles down the street. You never made speeches. You simply shared little pieces of yourself before apologizing for dreaming too much." I lowered my eyes toward the smooth wooden surface beneath my fingertips. I could still remember saying those words. I always laughed afterward as though I had said something foolish. Ryan continued speaking with the same calm honesty. "I started writing down the ideas after each conversation because I did not want them to disappear. Whenever I had free time, I built one piece at a time. Some projects took weeks. Others took months. None of them were meant to stay hidden forever." He walked toward a tall cabinet along the wall and carefully opened one of its wide wooden doors. Inside were neatly stacked sketchbooks labeled only by year. He handed the oldest one to me. I opened it carefully and found page after page of detailed drawings beside handwritten notes describing conversations I barely remembered having. Some pages included ideas I had mentioned while standing outside with a cup of coffee before work. Others referenced neighborhood conversations that I had completely forgotten. Ryan had preserved not only furniture designs, but also the moments when those dreams had still felt possible. I closed the sketchbook slowly, overwhelmed by a gratitude too large to describe. "I gave up on all of this," I admitted. "I decided my hands were not good enough anymore." Ryan looked directly at me, his expression steady and sincere. "No, Lucas, you only stopped believing they were." Those words settled deep inside me. Nobody had challenged that belief before because I had hidden it so well that even I had accepted it as fact. Ryan picked up a small block of maple from the workbench along with a finely balanced carving knife. Instead of handing me a finished project, he placed the unfinished wood gently into my hands. "I never wanted to build your dreams for you," he said. "I only wanted to make sure they were still waiting whenever you decided to come back." I looked down at the simple piece of wood resting in my palms. It was unfinished, imperfect, and full of possibility. For the first time in many years, I did not feel afraid of making a mistake. Through the workshop windows, the last of the storm clouds drifted away, allowing bright morning sunlight to fill every corner of the room. As I stood there surrounded by years of quiet patience and unexpected kindness, I realized the greatest gift Ryan had protected was never the furniture itself. It was the belief that the future I had abandoned had been waiting patiently for me all along. I stayed in Ryan's workshop long after the conversation ended, turning the unfinished block of maple over in my hands as though it carried an answer I had been searching for my entire life. Instead of asking me to become the person I used to be, Ryan had quietly given me permission to become someone new. We spent the rest of that Saturday walking through every corner of the workshop. He explained how each cabinet had been built to maximize natural light, why certain hardwoods were better for children's furniture, and how every project began with listening before measuring. What surprised me most was that many of the finished pieces were no longer there. Empty spaces lined several shelves where completed furniture had once stood. When I asked where everything had gone, Ryan smiled and led me outside through a side door connected to the workshop. We walked only a few houses down the street before I understood. A handmade reading bench sat beneath a large maple tree in the neighborhood park. A little farther away, colorful bookshelves filled the children's corner inside the local community center. Outside the church, sturdy flower planters surrounded the entrance, each crafted with the same careful attention to detail I had admired inside the workshop. Everywhere we went, I began recognizing Ryan's work, yet none of it carried his name. He simply built what people needed and quietly delivered it. An elderly woman waved as we passed and thanked Ryan for repairing her porch railing before introducing herself to me with the warmth of an old friend. A young father stopped to shake Ryan's hand because the picnic tables at the elementary school had survived another winter without needing repairs. Two children proudly showed us a birdhouse they had painted during one of Ryan's weekend woodworking classes. I watched every interaction with growing amazement. None of these people admired Ryan because he was talented. They trusted him because he consistently showed up when someone needed help. As we continued walking, Ryan finally explained something he had never mentioned before. Every other Saturday afternoon, neighbors gathered inside the workshop to build simple furniture for families facing difficult times, community organizations, libraries, and local schools. Retired carpenters volunteered beside college students. Teenagers learned practical skills from veterans. Parents brought their children so they could discover the joy of making something with their own hands. Nobody was charged for participating. Nobody cared about experience. The only expectation was kindness, patience, and a willingness to help the next person. I stood quietly for several moments, trying to absorb the quiet beauty of what he had created. This had never been about furniture. The workshop was simply a place where people rebuilt confidence one project at a time. Ryan looked at me with the same calm expression I had come to recognize since the storm. Next Saturday, we are building bookshelves for the new children's reading room at the library, he said. We could use another pair of hands if you feel ready. Months earlier, I would have found an excuse. I would have claimed I was too busy, too tired, or not skilled enough. This time, the words never came. Instead, I looked at my own hands, remembering how easily I had dismissed them for so many years. They had carried boxes, signed inventory forms, and completed routines that barely required imagination. Perhaps they were capable of something more after all. I smiled before I even realized I had made the decision. I would like that, I answered honestly. Ryan nodded as though he had never doubted my response. Together we began walking back toward the workshop while sunlight broke completely through the remaining clouds, filling the quiet neighborhood with warmth that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the feeling that, for the first time in years, I was finally walking toward a future instead of away from one. The following Saturday arrived with clear blue skies and cool morning air, and for the first time in years I woke before my alarm because I actually wanted to begin the day. Instead of driving to the warehouse on my usual day off, I carried a pair of work gloves across the lawn to Ryan's workshop. The large garage-style doors stood open, welcoming sunlight and laughter into the space that had once seemed mysterious behind a locked door. Inside, people of every age were already busy preparing lumber, organizing tools, and measuring boards for the children's library project. Ryan greeted each volunteer by name before introducing me with the same quiet confidence he seemed to offer everyone. Nobody asked why I was there or whether I had enough experience. They simply handed me a tape measure, pointed toward a stack of maple boards, and invited me to join them. At first, my hands felt stiff and uncertain. I measured every board twice before making even the simplest pencil mark. Ryan noticed my hesitation, but never corrected me unless I asked. Instead, he stood nearby, patiently demonstrating techniques that made every step feel manageable. The goal is not perfection, he reminded me. The goal is building something strong enough to help someone else. Those words stayed with me throughout the morning. As the hours passed, conversations filled the workshop. A retired carpenter shared stories about restoring historic homes across Oregon. A college student explained how learning woodworking had helped him manage stress during difficult semesters. Two middle school brothers proudly sanded shelves while competing to see who could leave the smoothest finish. Every person carried a different story, yet all of them worked toward the same purpose. During lunch, everyone gathered around folding tables outside beneath the shade of tall trees. Homemade casseroles, fresh sandwiches, fruit, and lemonade appeared from every direction as neighbors shared food without anyone keeping track of who had brought what. I realized this community had quietly built traditions that were far stronger than the furniture itself. Later that afternoon, Ryan invited me to assemble the final bookshelf. It was the largest piece we had worked on all day, and several volunteers stepped aside so I could complete the last section. My hands trembled slightly as I positioned the final shelf into place. Old doubts immediately returned, whispering that I would misalign the joints or split the wood. Ryan looked at me and simply nodded. "Take your time." I slowed my breathing, checked every measurement once more, and carefully secured the final pieces together. When the bookshelf stood upright without the slightest wobble, the workshop filled with warm applause that caught me completely by surprise. Nobody celebrated because the shelf was extraordinary. They celebrated because they knew what it had taken for me to believe I could finish it. I stepped back and rested my hand against the smooth maple surface, feeling something inside me become just as steady. Before everyone left for the evening, the completed bookshelves were loaded into a community trailer for delivery to the library the following morning. As we closed the workshop doors, Ryan handed me a small wooden carving that fit comfortably in the palm of my hand. It was shaped like a simple acorn. Seeing my puzzled expression, he smiled. "Every oak tree begins this way," he said. "Growth usually starts long before anyone notices." I turned the tiny carving over between my fingers as the setting sun painted the neighborhood with warm golden light. For years I had measured my life by everything I failed to become. Standing beside Ryan and surrounded by people who believed in quiet acts of kindness, I finally understood that healing did not happen all at once. It happened one honest conversation, one shared afternoon, one carefully crafted piece of wood, and one small act of courage at a time, until the person you thought you had lost slowly found the way home again. Over the next several months, Saturday mornings became the part of my week I looked forward to more than anything else. My weekday routine at the warehouse remained the same, but something inside me had quietly changed. Instead of coming home exhausted and falling into familiar habits of isolation, I found myself sketching furniture designs again at my kitchen table. The dusty notebooks that had remained untouched for years slowly filled with fresh ideas, and every weekend Ryan welcomed those ideas into the workshop with the same encouragement he had shown from the very beginning. He never criticized my drawings or compared them to his own work. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions that helped every design become stronger. Before long, I was contributing more than simple measurements and sanding. I was helping create reading tables for libraries, storage benches for community centers, and sturdy garden planters for neighborhood families. The greatest surprise was not how much I enjoyed building again. It was discovering how many people smiled because of something our hands had created together. One Saturday afternoon, the local library invited the entire neighborhood to celebrate the opening of its newly expanded children's reading room. The bookshelves we had built together now stood proudly along brightly painted walls filled with colorful books, comfortable reading corners, and cheerful decorations made by local students. Children rushed from shelf to shelf with excitement, while parents thanked every volunteer who had helped transform the space. Watching young readers settle into the handcrafted chairs we had carefully assembled reminded me that meaningful work often continued long after the tools had been put away. During the celebration, the library director surprised everyone by announcing that several nearby schools and nonprofit organizations had asked whether our workshop could help with future community projects. The room filled with applause, but I noticed Ryan quietly stepping away from the attention just as he always did. Recognition had never been his goal. Helping people had always been enough. Later that evening, after the celebration ended, Ryan and I returned to the workshop to put away a few remaining tools. The room felt peaceful beneath the warm glow of hanging lights. I looked around at the benches, the shelves, and the familiar scent of freshly cut wood that had once seemed mysterious but now felt like home. "You knew this would happen, did not you?" I asked. Ryan smiled while carefully placing a hand plane back onto its rack. "I hoped it might," he answered. "Communities grow when people believe they have something worth sharing." His words stayed with me as I walked slowly through the workshop. Months earlier, I had believed I had nothing valuable left to offer anyone. Now children were reading books from shelves my own hands had helped build. Families gathered around picnic tables we had crafted together. Elderly neighbors rested on benches shaped from ideas I once considered impossible. I stopped beside the large workbench where Ryan had first placed that unfinished block of maple into my hands. The memory felt both distant and surprisingly close. I reached into my jacket pocket and found the small wooden acorn he had given me weeks earlier. Its smooth surface had become polished from being carried everywhere with me. I smiled before setting it gently on the workbench. "I have made my decision," I said quietly. Ryan looked up without speaking. "I do not want this to be something I only visit on weekends anymore. I want to stay. I want to help build whatever comes next." Ryan's expression softened into the same warm smile that had greeted me on the stormy night when everything began. He did not celebrate or speak dramatically. He simply nodded once and said, "I was hoping you would choose that for yourself." Standing there together in the quiet workshop, surrounded by unfinished projects waiting to become part of someone else's story, I realized that home was never simply the place where you lived. Home was the place where your hands, your heart, and your hope finally found the courage to build the future together. 1 year later, another storm rolled across the neighborhood, but everything about that evening felt different. Rain tapped gently against the workshop windows while warm lights spilled onto the sidewalk, welcoming anyone who stepped inside. The same streets that had once seemed quiet and distant were now filled with familiar faces carrying homemade desserts, stacks of books, small woodworking projects, and laughter that blended naturally with the steady rhythm of the falling rain. Looking out across the gathering, I remembered standing alone in my dark house on the night that had changed everything, convinced that accepting help would somehow make me weaker. I smiled at the memory because I finally understood that allowing someone to care about you was never a weakness. It was often the first step toward becoming the person you were always meant to be. The workshop had grown far beyond anything either of us had imagined. Every weekend, new volunteers arrived to learn practical skills while experienced builders patiently shared what they knew. Children proudly carried birdhouses home for their backyards. High school students built benches for local parks as community service projects. Retired neighbors taught careful craftsmanship while discovering renewed purpose in passing their knowledge to another generation. Every completed project carried the same invisible message that Ryan had quietly lived by for years. Kindness became stronger whenever it was shared. I had left my warehouse position several months earlier after accepting a new role managing community woodworking programs alongside Ryan. During the week, we visited schools, libraries, and nonprofit organizations, helping people design projects that reflected the needs of their own neighborhoods. In the evenings, I still sketched furniture at my kitchen table, except now those drawings no longer disappeared into forgotten notebooks. They became real pieces built by many hands and used by countless families. Every so often, I caught myself smiling for no reason at all, and each time I realized the reason had been quietly growing for months. Ryan never asked me to become someone different. He simply believed in the person I had stopped believing existed. As guests gathered around long wooden tables inside the workshop, the library director stood to thank everyone for another successful year of community projects. She spoke about new reading spaces, renovated classrooms, neighborhood gardens, and hundreds of volunteer hours that had brought strangers together through simple acts of generosity. When she finished, applause filled the room, but Ryan once again stepped slightly behind everyone else, just as he always had. I reached for his hand without thinking, and he looked at me with the same calm smile that had first greeted me through the rain. Nothing dramatic needed to be said between us, because the life we had built together had already become the answer to every question I once carried. Later that evening, the guests slowly returned home while the rain continued falling outside. Ryan and I stood beneath the covered entrance of the workshop watching water ripple across the quiet street. The neighborhood lights reflected softly on the pavement, making everything glow with peaceful familiarity. I realized the weather looked remarkably similar to that unforgettable night 1 year earlier, yet my heart felt completely different. Back then, I had seen only darkness, uncertainty, and another reason to remain alone. Now I saw warmth shining through open doors, neighbors who had become family, and a future shaped not by fear, but by hope. Ryan glanced toward the rain and smiled. "Looks like another storm." I nodded, listening to the gentle sound that no longer reminded me of loneliness. "Maybe," I answered, "but sometimes storms do not arrive to take something away. Sometimes they arrive to lead you home. Together we watched the rain fall over the neighborhood we had helped build, knowing that the strongest homes were never created from wood alone. They were built one act of kindness, one shared dream, and one open door at a time.